All right, Will, why don't you take it away?
All right, good morning, and welcome to our second webinar in the EV charging infrastructure training series. Black & Veatch has partnered with S-Curve Strategies to develop this training series for Los Angeles County and the California Energy Commission. Black & Veatch has helped clients for more than a decade develop EV charging stations around the US and the world. All in, we've helped deploy more than 30,000 charging ports at more than 2,500 sites. We're excited to hold this webinar series to share our key insights for developing successful EV charging projects. This webinar is the second of 5 that we will host over the next 3 months to provide information about what you should consider when you're developing an EV charging site. In the second webinar, we'll share information about different business models and funding opportunities that you should consider as you set up a new EV charging location. A recording of the first webinar and the subsequent webinars will be posted on the Los Angeles County website for you to share with colleagues or reference in the future. If you have any questions during the training, please post them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the webinar. So let's get started with some introductions of our team today. I'm Will Einstein, and I'm a principal consultant at Black & Veatch, and I'm a member of our Clean Transportation Advisory practice. Prior to joining Black & Veatch, I spent more than 20 years in various roles leading the development of clean transportation and customer programs for a large electricity and natural gas utility. With me today are April Bolduc and Randy Shimka from S-Curve Strategies. April and Randy, can you introduce yourselves, please?
Thanks, Will. It's so great to be here. I'm April Bolduc, president of S-Curve Strategies, and over the last 15 years, I've done hundreds of EV charging site walks and spent a decade at San Diego Gas and Electric, with most of that time on their EV charging infrastructure team. And since starting S-Curve Strategies over 7 years ago, now. I've worked on transportation electrification projects across 13 states, so I'm really excited to talk to you all today about the business models of EV charging infrastructure. Randy.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Randy Shimka, and I work with April at S-Curve Strategies. I have over 35 years of utility engineering experience and over a decade of experience with clean transportation, vehicle, and charging system projects. I have BS and MS degrees in electrical engineering, as well as a professional engineer registration in the state of California. And I like to say that I walk the talk by driving an EV every day. And we've taken many all-electric road trips over the years. And of course, when I'm on those road trips, I spend a lot of time visiting different EV charging station installations to see what's going on in the real world out there. So I'm very happy to be here with you today to talk about EV charging business models.
Fantastic. And we have an exciting webinar series planned. Whether you're a policymaker, inspector, facility manager, or you're even just considering installing EV charging in your own site, the series is really designed to provide valuable insights in strategic site selection for EV chargers. And you may have completed webinar 1 in this series on charger siting best practices. And today we're going to focus on business models and financing. And also upcoming sessions are going to cover permitting, regulations, and site design. And as Will said, all the materials are going to be available on the website. So let's jump into what today's agenda is going to look like. And today's agenda includes a breakdown of 4 primary business models for EV charging and insights into utility rates, demand charges, and rebate programs, available incentives, and then strategies for submitting winning rebate or grant applications. So let's jump into the models themselves. There are 4 EV charging business models and 4 main pathways to deploying EV charging. There's organization owned, which offers full ownership and operational control. Charging as a service, which allows the outsourcing of management via a subscription. And then third-party owned, which is where you lease the space to external operators. And then a hybrid. So by that, we mean it's really a mix of ownership and outsourcing. And the right choice of these options depends on your budget, What's your risk tolerance? What are your long-term goals? So a thorough evaluation of each of these factors is what's going to help select the most appropriate business model for your EV charging infrastructure projects. And even if you're in the business of working at a municipality, it's going to help you be able to converse with those that are submitting for projects as well. So let's do a deeper dive into this organization-owned model. So with this model, the organization, or we're using organization interchangeably with site host, operates and the chargers outright. So this model suits those with capital for upfront costs and the staff to manage maintenance. And examples would include large corporations, property management firms, and a lot of fleets use this operational model as well. So let's break this down in the organization model, kind of on this process flow chart here. So we have the organization that installs and owns the chargers. You have the EV charging stations, and then you have the EV users, which are the drivers. And so the organization has the option to charge a usage fee to the drivers, and typically in the form of a per kilowatt hour charge. If you're a fleet model, of course, you're not going to charge your fleets for the fee, but if you're an organization-owned model, this is really key for you here. And this requires an increased investment over time due to the organization providing maintenance, maybe has some networking fees, etc. And then the organization operates and owns the chargers itself. Let's look at some of the challenges and really opportunities around the organization-owned model. Let's start with the opportunities. One of the biggest advantages is revenue retention. So your organization keeps all the charging fees, which can help offset the costs over time. You also have full control of the installation, operations, maintenance. And what this does is it allows you to tailor the charging experience to your community's needs. Additionally, the charging stations then become assets, and that can increase your property value, especially in high traffic areas that are using the charging stations, for example, if they're public. There's a lot of flexibility here. You can integrate EV charging infrastructure with your smart building initiatives like solar or battery storage, and that can help enhance your sustainability goals and programs for this particular location. And now for the challenges. So the upfront capital investment is significant in this business model, and it can range from, tens of thousands of dollars to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the type of chargers you install, the size of the installation. And on top of that, you're exposed to technology risks. So for example, as EV charging hardware evolves rapidly, and finally, scaling your infrastructure as EV adoption grows can be complex. And so that requires additional planning and investments. And one thing too that I want to say about maintenance is that you either have to have specialized staff or trained staff to really support that maintenance, or to get a third party and outsource to a third party to help support that maintenance. So those are a couple of the maintenance models. In short, this model gives you control and long-term benefits, but demands careful planning, sufficient resources, and really a clear strategy around scaling. And let's look at an example of a retail center, because as often is the case, a local property manager represents, for example, a distant center landowner. The property manager installs, it owns, it operates the bank of public, let's say level 2 and fast chargers for the shopping center for the shoppers that are visiting the center. And so the property firm purchases and installs, but they are able to leverage the Cal EVIP rebate alongside the utility charger rebate, which is really a significant savings. The firm then pays an ongoing electric bill as well as the network fee, which has to do with the charging stations, and then the maintenance costs. But the firm receives in turn driver billing revenue minus a small fee. And one thing to say about the driver revenue is these aren't really big money makers unless you're in a location that has a really high volume and can, really utilize the charging stations. But what's great about this model, and especially for this particular retail center, is that the results were that it increased foot traffic to the retail center. So that means tenant satisfaction. And then they also developed a marketing campaign around how sustainable now their retail centers are. And so let's look at this who pays model. Another way to think about, really dividing up these costs is who pays in this organization-owned model. So it's the organization and as well as the charging provider. And here in this organization-owned model, the organization pays for chargers and installation, the electric bill, the networking fees. So those networking fees go to the charging provider, as well as the maintenance costs and the billing service fee. What they receive, though, are the rebates from funds from the utility and state, and the driver billing revenue from the service providers. So the reason why, for example, the rebate funds and the driver billing revenue service, you see a couple of different price points there. That's because, as I mentioned before, it really does depend on whether or not you have a large installation or you have a really small installation. The charging provider then pays the driver revenue to the organization, but they also receive the sale of the chargers from the organization. They receive the networking fees, the maintenance costs, the billing service fee. So as you can see, this nicely lays out in a clear way the types of fees to consider, and as you're negotiating with your provider as to how to work through that contract. The cost components and revenue change depending on the side, and then the site host profitability really does depend on that number of charging stations. All right, Randy, I'm going to turn it over to you for charging as a service.
All right, thanks very much. So as we move down our road of the different types of business models, I like to talk about the business model that we call charging as a service. So this covers scenarios where a third party installs and owns and maintains the EV chargers, and the third party works with the organization, and they negotiate some kind of a subscription or usage fee that the organization pays to the third party provider, and then that covers the cost of the charging stations and the services. So let's look at some more details about this particular scenario. We have a flow diagram that shows the basics of how this model would work. So the service provider purchases and installs and owns and operates and maintains the charging stations, and they also pay the utility electric bill. The provider then offers these charging services to the EV users or drivers, who in turn pay for their charging to the service provider. The organization pays that recurring flat service or subscription fee to the service provider. And this is a way for the organization to get into EV charging without a big capital budget outlay, and this model reduces it down to a monthly subscription payment, while at the same time outsourcing most of the responsibilities to that third party. So now let's take a look at the opportunities and the challenges for this particular model. On the opportunity side, the organization or site host saves on the capital expenses, like I mentioned. It's simpler for them because all the heavy lifting is outsourced, and it makes their budget more predictable with that subscription fee, and they can take advantage of the provider's expertise in the EV charging space. And on the challenge side of the equation, this model pretty much removes the possibility of the organization earning a profit because of that subscription fee and the outsourcing. And they'll have to make a commitment and sign a contract for a payment fee for some period of time. The organization is also dependent on the partner that they choose for keeping the charging stations working and available, as well as providing support. And finally, so when choosing a partner, a provider, make sure that the provider's standard systems will integrate or communicate with the organization's already existing systems. And an example of this could be a vehicle telematics monitoring system in the case of fleet vehicles. So next up, we have an example of charging as a service, what a site would look like. So in this example, we have a local office complex tenant acting as the site host, and they sign a contract with a third party to purchase and install and manage and maintain some level 2 EV chargers. Of course, this agreement has to be done with the full cooperation and written approval of the property owner. The tenant and the provider negotiate then the monthly service fee, the subscription fee for the charging stations and for the provider services. And in return, the third-party provider is responsible for providing the charging stations, as well as the monitoring and the management of the chargers and any maintenance costs that pop up. And they also keep most of the billing revenue from drivers. And as we've mentioned, one advantage of using this model is that it allows the tenant to offer the EV charging stations to their employees or visitors as an amenity, but without all the operational responsibilities that are involved. And it makes for a pretty clean setup from a tenant perspective. This example would also be applicable for fleet vehicle charging as well. So next up, we have the who pays information. So here's more detail related to that. And on the organization side, they pay that monthly subscription fee to cover the costs to the charging provider. The provider, on the other hand, pays for everything that it takes to deliver the whole charging experience, including the charging stations, the installation, the monitoring, the electric bill, the networking fees, and whatever maintenance is required. And then they receive the subscription fee from the organization and the driver billing revenue. If there are any rebates, then they would ultimately pass from the organization to the provider and be worked into that negotiation for the monthly subscription fee. The key to this scenario is to arrive at a fair price for both parties that allows the charging provider to cover their costs and then some. And of course, every site is different and the monthly fee would vary depending on the number and the type of chargers as well as their usage. All right, I'm going to hand it back over to April to talk about the third-party owned business model.
Fantastic. So in the third-party owned structures, companies install, own, and operate charging infrastructure. They're responsible for all aspects of the charging. The revenue is typically retained by the third party, though the host organization may receive lease payments or revenue share, which is really fantastic for the property owner. And ideally, this would really be perfect for public spaces, for commercial locations looking to monetize charging stations. And as we move into this flow diagram, we can see a little bit better as to what this scenario looks like. So we have the third-party owner on the left. That's the organization allows the third party to install and operate the chargers on their property. Then the EV charging stations provide the services to the driver, and the drivers pay for charging. Then the third-party owner pays a lease payment and revenue share of the driver usage fees back to the organization. And the organization also collects that lease payment and portion of revenue. And when it does come to this lease payment, they are giving up spaces, which is significant, for example, as part of that lease. So this negotiation is really critical when it comes to considering how you're going to negotiate this contract with that third-party owner. And again, it provides a small amount of revenue for the third-party owner, but then that lease payment of revenue is shared with the organization. And so let's look at the opportunities and challenges. The third-party owned business model offers a low-risk way, I would say, for municipalities or property owners to provide EV charging infrastructure while outsourcing all of the heavy lifting. So let's start with the opportunities. This model requires a minimum capital investment for the host, since the third-party operator handles the installation, the maintenance, the operation, and then return, this organization or host benefits from revenue sharing, they benefit from lease payments, and this ensures that the chargers are maintained up to date with evolving technology. It allows your organization to focus on its core core mission while still providing valuable EV amenities. However, as we know, like with anything, there are challenges to consider. So the third-party operator typically retains most of the revenue. This limits your financial upside But there's also the risk of misalignment with your sustainability or customer service goals since you have little control over pricing and operations. Furthermore, the quality of the service and the responsiveness depends entirely on the external operator, and this can affect the user satisfaction if issues arise. So you want to make sure that you have that great partnership with this third party. And lastly, negotiating the contracts with favorable terms can be complex and time-consuming. So in summary, this model is really ideal for those looking to minimize risk and upfront costs, but it requires careful contract management and alignment with your organization's broader goals. So let's jump into who pays. As you can see, let's jump into the example. So the public parking garage is the example that we have here. And the third-party charging company, they contract with the public parking garage owner to install and operate DC fast chargers. So what does the third party pay? They pay, as we've discussed, the chargers, installation, operation and maintenance, the electric bill, and the network fees. And they also receive revenue generated from the driver. And again, this is really going to depend on the traffic volume coming to their location, but they can also have a little creativity here with the option for advertising partnerships. So in this photo, you can see, and you've probably seen on any charging station, the ability to have screens on the chargers or in other locations. And with that, they're able to partner with different advertising firms to be able to offer advertising through and to generate revenue for the third party. Now, the parking garage, what's beneficial for them is that they have no upfront costs or ongoing costs, and they're getting new EV driver customers to this location, which can benefit the stores around it. So the results would be that the owner decides to install charging into all their locations, which is what we see happen all the time. And then the owner can market itself as a sustainability leader in its offerings to its investors and into the community. So now let's look at who pays here. And we already talked about that the organization receives that lease payment from the charging provider, no upfront capital costs, monthly service fees. And this is where it's key to have that negotiation really work out well. And the charging provider pays the chargers, installation maintenance, the electric bill, the network fees, but they receive those rebate funds from the utility and state. So the organization most likely will have to file and submit for those funds, and then they would provide those funds back to the charger provider, helping the charging provider significantly reduce their costs. And then the billing revenue would come from drivers as well as the revenue from the advertising partnerships. And Randy, I'll turn it over to you for the hybrid model, our last of our 4 EV charging business models.
All right, so I'll talk about the fourth model here, the hybrid model. It combines some elements of the previous models, and it could take several different forms. There could be a scenario where the organization owns and operates some charging stations on their property, but maybe they want to outsource the purchase and operation of some additional chargers to a third party. Or it could be a scenario where the organization purchases and installs charging stations, but they outsource all of the operation and the monitoring and the maintenance to a third party. In many cases, this can provide additional flexibility for the organization based on their needs at the particular site, or it can also allow the organization to more easily scale their EV charging by using a third party. Next up, we're going to have a flow diagram. It's going to show details about the hybrid model scenario. And in this case, the organization owns and installs some EV chargers. They also pay the utility electric bill. And the organization then signed a contract with a third-party service provider to monitor and operate and maintain the chargers. And the organization then shares driver revenue with the service provider to help them offset costs. So next up, we're going to talk about opportunities and challenges with the hybrid model. On the opportunity side, there's a balance between the organization doing the work or outsourcing the operation of the charging stations to the third party. The organization leverages the third-party service provider's expertise for operations and maintenance of the chargers. And operational costs can be reduced with the revenue sharing and the outsourcing of the service or the outsourcing of the operation and maintenance functions. And there's flexibility to update the agreement with the service provider in response to any changes at the site with any tech advancements or upgrades or any changing business needs. On the challenge side, this scenario is a little bit more complex, so roles have to be well defined and communication between the parties is key. Negotiating the revenue sharing aspect will require some detailed contractual terms with clear agreements and performance metrics. And as I mentioned before, there can be integration issues between the systems of the organization and the provider, so those expectations should be explored and put into the contract between the parties up front. On the plus side, the hybrid model provides greater flexibility for the organization and allows them to bring in and take advantage of outside expertise to provide and manage EV charging stations for them. So next up, we have an example for the hybrid model, and it highlights an apartment community where the property owner purchased the EV charging equipment and had it installed. So the owner pays the electric bill, but they really didn't want to take on the work of managing the charging stations themselves, so they outsourced that function to a third-party provider. So this allows the site host then to provide the EV chargers as an amenity for their tenants, but without having to take on all the day-to-day management and operational responsibilities. With this model, the owner has a new amenity to offer EV driving tenants, can perhaps charge higher lease costs to those tenants to help pay for the charging stations, but yet they're avoiding the day-to-day operations and maintenance for those charging stations. So next up, we'll look at more detail associated who pays for that hybrid model. So on the organization side, they pay for the EV charging stations and the installation costs. They also pay the electric bill to the utility, as well as that negotiated fee to the charging provider for all the networking and the maintenance and the monitoring and management of the charging stations. In addition, the organization also pays a small fee for the billing function to drivers, and you can think of it like a credit card fee. It's a small fee. If the site qualifies, then the organization could receive grant funds. And in this particular example, the organization receives most of the driver billing revenue minus that small billing fee. The charging provider then would receive the proceeds from selling the charging stations to the organization, and they would also receive that negotiated fee for the networking and the maintenance, monitoring, and management functions that they perform for the organization. They also receive a small service fee from the site host for doing the billing, and then they pay most of those driver billing funds back to the organization. Profitability in the EV charging world can be difficult to achieve on the organization side due to the upfront equipment costs and the energy costs. And of course, this is where the rebates or other subsidies help. But the amount of money that the organization may make on EV charging really depends on the amount of energy dispensed, as well as the price of energy that's billed to EV drivers. And on that topic, I'm going to hand it off to Will, who's going to discuss utility rates and demand charges, among other things.
Wonderful. Thanks, Randy. We'll now review the key elements of the utility rates that you should consider as you plan a charging project. Utility rates are designed to represent the cost the utility incurs for serving the customer, and they are used to calculate the customer's bill. For commercial customers, there are three significant components of electric utility rates. First, the price per kilowatt hour for the energy that's used. Second, the time at which the energy is used. Many electric utilities now charge different rates for energy at different times of the day. These time of use energy rates, or TOU rates as they're sometimes called, are intended to reflect how the price of energy changes throughout the day. Lastly, demand charges are charges commercial customers incur for the greatest amount of energy that they use at any one time in a month. For EV charging site customers, a high monthly demand charge can significantly impact operational costs, especially with the amount of energy consumed by a DC fast charging site. Some utilities are introducing commercial EV rates or providing other benefits like suspending demand charges to encourage the development of EV charging and help offset the costs for new EV charging sites that have low initial utilization. For these low sites, as the charging station utilization grows, a high-performing site can manage its costs by spreading out the cost of a demand charge over a larger number of charging sessions and kilowatt hours sold. Understanding how utility rates for a site are applied for EV charging is really key to minimizing operational costs for a particular charging location. Currently, the best strategy for controlling costs of charging EVs is to try to balance the amount of electricity needed at any time and the amount of time you need to charge the vehicle. As we go beyond the rates and charges from utilities, many utilities are now offering rebates for customers who install EV chargers at residential and commercial sites. As mentioned in some of the business models, these rebates often will cover only a percentage of the total site cost, but they can be used to help offset a significant portion of the initial purchase, the installation costs, and sometimes even the ongoing operational costs. Some utilities will also increase rebate amounts for chargers that are installed in underserved communities. For any rebate, it's important to identify any program rules that are set by the utility. These rules can include requirements to use network charging equipment, to gather data and share information about the site and how it's performing. They can also include other requirements for displaying charging prices and rates on the charger at a particular location. Many of the Southern California electric utilities offer rebate programs for charging infrastructure. These programs vary from utility to utility, so it's important that you make contact with the electric utility or research the program benefits and requirements on their website to make sure you fully understand what's offered. Beyond the utility rebate programs, we'll spend a couple minutes talking about local government, government incentives. At the federal, state, and local level, agencies are providing direct funding or tax credits to support the development of charging sites. At the federal level, laws passed by Congress during the Biden administration provided significant additional grant funds and tax credits for EV charging projects. The grant funds were largely distributed by the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, while the EV infrastructure tax credits were administered by the Internal Revenue Service. A new program through the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by the last Congress allows tax-exempt utility entities to get direct funding from EV infrastructure as if they were taking the tax credit. The project and the applicant must meet the requirements for the credit as if they were a tax-paying entity. It's important to note that these federal programs may be changed by current Congress and the Trump administration over the balance of the remainder of this year. At the state level, the California Energy Commission oversees two programs that provide funding for EV charging projects. The Cal EV IP program provides funding for the development of medium and fast charging infrastructure throughout the state, and the Communities in Charge program provides funding for public level 2 community charging equipment at commercial and multifamily properties. At the local level, many local agencies and air quality management districts also provide incentives to help us accelerate the development of charging projects in communities. As many of the rules and funding levels for these programs can change, we encourage you to research the programs in your area as you're planning for your project. The good news, as April mentioned in some of the business models, is that many of these funding incentives can be stacked or added together to help reduce the cost of a charging project for a local government or commercial property owner. Now I'll hand it back to April to talk about what makes a winning incentive application.
Thanks so much, Will. Yeah, it's so important, as you said, partner with your utility and really understand those incentives. And as we talk about incentives, securing them isn't just about checking the boxes. It's really about strategic alignment within your organization. So for example, last year, a small local city lost $250,000 in the Cal EVIP rebates because their charger locations missed the equity zone cutoff by just 2 blocks. So we want to help you ensure that your projects avoid that pitfall. And so when it comes to developing these, every funding program has a specific mission. So whether it's improving air quality or disadvantaged communities or expanding EV access in rural areas. And one of the most common reasons that we see to miss out on these incentives is because no one is tracking compliance with eligible requirements within your organization. So that's why it's critical to dedicate someone on your team. You can call them the compliance quarterback, because they're going to ensure that all the boxes are checked. So whether it's submitting required documents on time or meeting the technical specifications or ensuring that all the documents are included, this is the person that's really gonna, the glue that's holding everything together and all those moving parts. And they're gonna help to maximize funding. So you'll need a layer of multiple programs together in order to do this, because each program has its own application process and its own reporting requirements. So the plan for overlapping timelines and deliverables is really key. And it's also key to stay organized and treat this like a coordinated campaign as you're getting ready to submit for each of these stacked incentives. Every funding program has its own priorities, so your application really should speak directly to those goals. For example, in some instances with utility programs, they tend to be more straightforward. You're submitting the facts, what you've already completed, but in other instances with state grants, they want to know more about kind of some of the broader issues that you're looking at. So for example, if it's about grid resilience, they want you to emphasize how your chargers are going to use off-peak energy or integrate with solar systems. So the more you align your narrative around with the funder's objectives, the stronger your application submission will be. And you can follow that format each year as you submit for these funds. Documentation can really make or break your application. So funders want to see that you've done your due diligence on the detailed project plans. And for some utilities, those require a percentage of design work that's actually completed ahead of time. And really be proactive about gathering these materials early. And it's also crucial to show why your own project matters. So not just in terms of the infrastructure, but in the broader context of the community and the environmental impact. So highlight how your project will reduce emissions, improve air quality, or expand access to EV charging in underserved areas. If the program prioritizes equity or sustainability, make sure you connect your project directly with each of those goals that the funder is looking to see. Also position the funding really as a stepping stone. Explain how it's going to serve as a catalyst for future EV charging developments or broader electrification plans in your community, because funders want to see that your investment is going to have a ripple effect, maybe on your other properties, but also in the community as a whole. And finally, don't go it alone. So collaborate with consultants or organizations experienced in grant writing to strengthen your application. Leverage all available resources in this case, because you're going to be helping to save yourself some money, like training programs, the templates that a lot of the funders offer. And this is going to ensure that your submission is polished, it's competitive, and the more experience that you bring to the table in order to do this, the stronger your case will be. Randy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, I have some considerations to keep in mind for participating in a utility make-ready rebate program. The first thing we like to emphasize is the need for coordination with your utility as early as possible, so that they'll have all the time to do the internal work on your project to make sure that they can deliver the energy that you need for the project. There's also lead times for them for equipment needed on the utility side to provide that in electric service. So the earlier that you work with them, the better. And it's also really important to submit a very complete set of high quality materials with your project application, with the goal of a first review approval on the utility side. And of course, you also need to ensure that the necessary permits and approvals are planned for and obtained along the way as you coordinate with the utility. There's also some details that you need to put together for your application that are related to the make-ready requirements that you're going through the process. This is a follow-on from the site host process that we discussed in the last webinar. So for example, once you have the site identified and nailed down where the EV charging stations are going to be located, that information then needs to be included in the utility project application. And information will be needed about the charging station type and quantities and the relevant electrical specifications, the power requirements of the charging stations, etc. And the utility will also want to know what the voltage requirements are for that new electric service that you're going to be needing. So you'll have to provide this information about project timelines and milestones as well, per the requirements of the program for funding purposes. And it also goes without saying that the compliance with all the electrical codes and safety standards is mandatory. Your contractor will be a great resource for that type of information. We have some additional considerations to discuss as well here on the next page. So as far as streamlining that make-ready process, the best way to do that is to create a very detailed plan with all the necessary steps and responsibilities of the parties defined. Of course, to take full advantage of that plan and get the best results, you'll need to keep it up to date and follow it through to project completion. You'll also want to hire an experienced contractor that is familiar with all the necessary utility protocols. And in fact, many of the utilities have a list of contractors that have been approved to work on these projects, and you should interview contractors from those lists and choose the best one for your project. And if there's any training requirements in the program for the contractor and the electricians, such as the EV infrastructure training program, then you'll also want to include that in the vetting process for choosing a contractor. One final tip I have is to make sure that you have a person that is dedicated to tracking and documenting all the various expenses for the project. This is really important so that you can get the proper reimbursement for the utility and also in a timely manner. Utility programs usually have very specific requirements about milestones and what documentation they need to process those reimbursements. So it's better to be prepared up front with those materials so that reimbursements can be received in a timely manner. Working with your utility provider and addressing these make-ready considerations will help to ensure that you're going to have a smooth process with your project and that you'll also be able to maximize the incentives and the benefits that you get from the utility. So next up, we're going to talk about choosing a charger for your project. And most utilities, including Edison and LADWP here locally, have specific requirements about which charging equipment needs to be purchased to participate in their programs. So they've created special lists of charging equipment that comply with the many different safety and operational criteria that they've put together for their programs. So instead of reinventing the wheel and spending the time and resources of creating and keeping these equipment lists up to date, many utilities will rely on organizations like the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, to vet and maintain the lists of the latest certified chargers for their programs. The resource page has a link to the EPRI website that has all the approved and certified charging station vendors and equipment for Edison's programs, and LADWP maintains their own lists and updates quarterly on their website. I'd like to hand it off now to April to talk about the key takeaways from today's topics.
All right. So in wrapping this up, before we jump into Q&A and I turn it over to Will, including consider these factors when choosing a model. You really want to match the business model to your own objectives. So for example, when it comes to budget, organization owned requires capital and third-party owned minimizes capital. When it comes to risk, charging as a service really transfers that operational risk away from the property owner or the organization. And then if you're concerned about control, that hybrid model really balances out the ownership and the outsourcing together. So why don't I hand it over to you, Will, to talk about resources.
Wonderful. Thank you, April. On this slide, we've listed some of the primary utility and government online resources that you can reference for the programs that we've mentioned throughout this webinar. And we hope that these sites will help you explore potential funding opportunities for your project as you get into them. So now we'll move into our Q&A session. As I mentioned earlier in the webinar, if you have a question, please use the Q&A button to ask a question. While you're submitting your questions, I will mention that the recording for this webinar and the other webinars in this series will be posted on the LA County website. The next webinars in this series, parts 3, 4, and 5, will be held in April and May of this year. And so we hope that you'll register for those. For our first question, is it better to offer charging to employees for free as an amenity, or is it better to charge employees for the use of the station as they do it? April, can you help us with that one?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that Randy and I have run into this quite a bit. So you would initially think that, yes, I mean, it's so great if you can offer free charging to your employees. But what we've actually found is the opposite, and I'll give you some examples. So we had a client that had, of the employees that they had driving to work, they had 500 driving EVs. And so obviously this happened over time. And what we found is that employees, no matter how close they live to work or how far they live to work, they were all racing to get the chargers, to get to the chargers, because they didn't want to pay for charging at home. So if you don't have to pay for it at home and you can get it at work for free, why would you pay for, charging at home? So they started having issues between the employees and the parking lots. They started having issues with those employees that lived 45 minutes, an hour drive away. They weren't able to access charging when they got there because the ones that lived, up the street got there much quicker. So these are some things to consider when you're thinking about, should we charge our employees or should we give it as an amenity? Because even if you do have the budget to give it as an amenity, you may want to reconsider.
Wonderful. Yeah, I know it's an important consideration, particularly for all the site hosts, as to how the pricing structure is set up for the particular chargers and the behaviors you're trying to incentivize or manage through. For our next question, maybe April, you can help us with this one as well. How do business models change as we talked about them if you're planning the charging site for a fleet versus some of the publicly available or employee available sites that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so I can give you a couple good examples. On the organization-owned model, so the change there would be if you're implementing your EV charging infrastructure for a fleet, you would not be getting the revenue source from the drivers. Now, when it comes to tracking that source, you may want to implement a system or a key fob that when a fleet goes and uses those charging stations, you're able to track which department is actually using that electricity so that you can bill those departments back. But that's a lot different than, actually having a public charging station that's organization owned. And then also in the charging as a service owned, and feel free to jump in, Randy, but a perfect example that I can give you as charging as a service would be a school district. So where a school district doesn't have the capital to install, but they do want to have, someone manage charging for their fleet. Randy, is there any other examples that you've seen?
No, those are probably the two examples that I would also think of. Yeah, good job.
All right. Our next question that's come in is really around sort of utility infrastructure. Randy, maybe you can help with this. Do charging station installations require a new electrical service?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for that. We covered this a little bit in the earlier webinar, and I think it has to do with the size, the number of charging stations that a person is going to put in or a firm is going to put in. If it's just one or two, say level 2 charging stations, then maybe you can find an electric panel in the building that has enough spare capacity to install those couple of chargers on that panel. But if you're talking about quite a collection of level 2 chargers or even DC fast chargers, then a new electric service is probably going to be needed just to handle, the energy that's going to be required for those chargers. And then a bonus for getting that new electric service installed is that when there are rates that the utility provides for those charging stations, special EV rates, then you can qualify for it with a new electric service. But if you just hook up those 2 or 3 stations to the existing building panel, then that won't be able to be qualified for the electric rate because it's mixed building load with the charging load. So that's kind of the cutoff point, I think, is just the quantity of stations.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. The quantity of stations and really being able to, as we talked about the utility rates and rebates and programs that the utility can offer, sometimes that could be the gateway, as you mentioned, sort of to being able to access those rates. So it's an important thing to think through as you're planning your site. Randy, maybe you can also help us with this next question. Can you explain more about how network fees work for charging stations, and how are they different from the other service fees that are charged by charging providers?
Okay. So I think of network fees as related to the cellular network. So the charging stations have to use that connection to get out to the network, to the cloud, to report the consumption and to do the billing transactions with the provider. They generally range in the neighborhood of, say, $25 to $35 per month per charger. So they're not super large fees, but they're certainly there, and there's certainly a cost. You asked about some of the other fees. A maintenance fee sounds like exactly what it is. You know, you may not have any maintenance for a long time, but then all of a sudden someday somebody backs into the charging station and knocks it over. And so it needs to be propped up or replaced or repaired. And so that maintenance fee would come into play at that point. And some providers sell maintenance contracts where it's just a standard fee no matter what the issue is. And then other providers just charge for the maintenance as it arises. Are there any other fees that we didn't talk about? The billing fee, we talked about that a little bit.
Mhm.
As I mentioned, that's kind of like a credit card fee. So it's usually just a small number of percentage points that the provider would charge to process all the payments. Yeah, those are the type of fees that come to mind.
Thanks. That's super helpful. There can be a lot of fees depending upon the business model that you select for operating these charging stations. As I look through the other questions that have come in, the next one that I think would be good to cover is April, maybe you have any thoughts about whether the question is, do utilities require you to have started planning and design for a site before you apply for rebates or make ready incentives? And sort of how far do you have to get into the process before you can start applying?
Yeah, sure. So in some instances, they require you to be significantly ahead of that process. So a significant percentage, even up to 60% of the project is complete, because they want to know that when they give you the funds, that the project is definitely going in, and it's also going to go in a quick amount of time, or as quick as you possibly can, because they want to see these dollars being put to work. So in some instances, when you have more of federal grants and things, that is really, they don't want you to start construction. So that's different, right? And then you're going to be implementing that federal grant when it comes to EV charging infrastructure over time. And they've given you an amount of time that that's going to be installed. Maybe that's 2 years or 3 years in some cases, because for larger projects, it does take that long. But for the more local utility projects, they want to see that you have some skin in the game before they give you that funding. And they want it because they have to be able to report out to their regulators that these funds were really put to work. And this is exactly the results. This is how many cars they look to help, or how many fleet vehicles that they look to help. So I would say that's kind of how I think about the two separate types of more local versus like federal funding, and how much you have to plan ahead.
So there is one thing that I could add to that response too, and that is, I see this a lot. Sometimes a person or a company that wants to put in chargers will have 2 or 3 locations in mind. They haven't really finalized where the chargers are going to go. They're looking for some help perhaps from the utility. So it's really difficult to fill out an application for a utility program when you're still shopping for sites. And you might need help from the utility, or maybe from your contractor or consultant, but you need to funnel those choices down to one choice to move forward with the application. It doesn't work if you don't do that.
And to one of the last points April mentioned, I have heard of some utilities that have even required for fleet charging projects a commitment of sort of how many vehicles and what type of vehicles
Right.
are going to be acquired by the entity that are going to be using the charging. And largely that is, as April mentioned, to guarantee or to commit the organization that they really are going to spend these dollars on this, and that they are working towards transitioning fleet vehicles towards zero emission or electric vehicles, and taking advantage of the charging rebates so that they're not going unused, or they're not sufficiently used compared to what another customer might be doing.
And you're right, getting an electric, car, truck, or bus, I mean, that is a significant commitment for many organizations.
Yep. Yep. Maybe as a last question in the time we have left, Randy, maybe you can talk about the useful life of charging stations, and we got a question about sort of how long does the equipment last, and how often will they have to swap it out or upgrade?
That is a very good question. I have a lot of experience with this because I started driving electric in 2011 with a Nissan Leaf and visited a lot of the charging stations that have been put in along the way. So the longevity of the equipment really does depend on the design of the equipment. We saw some of the early stations that had liquid crystal displays that would get black spots on them in the sun. And I think that a lot of people have learned along the way, that's not really the greatest way to handle the charging station hardware. And so, and of course, people can be hard on the equipment. If it's my own station in my garage, I treat it respectfully. But if it's in a public spot, I see people throw it on the ground or even drive over the cables. So in general terms, I would say the level 2 charging stations probably have the longest lifespan, several years. I've seen quite a number of level 2 stations that have been out there for several years, and they're still going strong. The DC fast chargers are a lot more complicated. There's a lot more inside to go wrong with those. And so I would say that those, and also technology catching up with them, new technology and new designs, those probably have a shorter lifespan than the level 2. So maybe just a few years for the DC fast, maybe just, 3, 4, 5 years in that respect. Level 2, a little bit longer. It just really depends on the design of the station and how it's constructed and the quality and so forth.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly for sites that are considering installing DC fast chargers, the technology that we're seeing that the cars are able to accept, the technology that's evolving within the charging stations, and sort of how they are networked, and frankly, their reliability. The reliability of all the components inside really is going to start to factor in. And so I think you're very correct in that the level 2 charging stations we're seeing them last the longest.
Right.
Whether it's either through technology advancements or just use and wear and tear, the DC fast charging sites,
Yeah.
particularly if you do end up creating sort of a high volume site, can need to be replaced on a much more frequent basis to keep up with technology or to just manage the wear and tear from the charging public.
So there was an earlier model of DC fast charging that came out, and it had a cooling fan that was located just a few inches off the ground. And so it would catch a lot of dust and dirt and debris in that filter when the cooling fan would work, and it would get clogged up very quickly, and then the station wouldn't work. It would get too hot. So it took a while, I think, for the providers to really figure out, some of the simple aspects of design. You definitely don't want to have that sort of a situation with the cooling system way down low like that, where it picks up all the dirt and dust from outside.
Wonderful.
I think we've learned a lot over the years.
Yes, we have.
Yeah.
All right, April, I think that answers all of the questions that we got.
Great. So thank you everyone for joining. If you have any questions, you can definitely reach out to Laura Inaconi or Jennifer Carton at LA County. Their email address is here. You'll probably be receiving an email from them too about our next webinar, and we can post that in the chat. I don't know if you're able to do that, Will. But thanks again, everyone, for coming, and you'll be hearing from us regarding the webinar number 3. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.